can send your question to everybody, and I'll try and answer it during the session. So does anybody have any questions about that? You can chat your question, you can raise your hand, or you can unmute yourself and ask that. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Bob to kind of get into the introduction part of it.
Okay, thank you. So as most of you, I think, can see the list of participants. I'm just going to walk through real quickly in the order that they show up here. Obviously, myself, I've been involved with this program this grid modernization program for a while, so they've asked me to help lead much of the discussion. And we'll have a few other folks from Commerce, such as Kate and Forrest Watkins and Michael Barish, talk about some of the other programs and what this ECPAC charter is about and how this feeds into that. Other folks we have on already is Colin Young from Great Clallam PUD, Daniel Kirshen from UW, David Logston from Seattle City Light, Elaine Markham from PSC, Jennifer Harper from Energy Northwest, Jeremy Twitchell from PNNL, Joel Swisher from Western Washington University, and also Joel is on the ECPAC committee. John Gibson from Avisa, Juliet Redanza, she's an intern at Commerce. Linda Irvine, she's with Spark Northwest. Lisa Rennie from Tacoma Power. Russell Guerry from Opalco. Scott Gibson from Snohomish PUD. Stephen Paget from Saison. And Tanya Barham from Community Energy Labs. Is there anybody else on there that I missed? If I did, please unmute yourself and speak up. Okay. So we have a lot of material to cover today. We're going to start with an overview of the Energy and Climate Policy Advisory Committee and how that came out of the legislation last year and what its charter is and how this group is going to provide some feed into that. We sent out a document in advance on the background of that or the purpose of the charter for this stakeholder group. But Kate is going to walk through a handful of slides here and do the overview of that. And if people have questions, please bring them up in the chat box. And then we'll go through the background on not just the grid mod program, but some other programs that have been developed recently with the electrification of transportation and the CEF solar program. And then we're going to spend about an hour on some discussion points that were sent out prior, also reflected in the agenda, but we're going to expand those into some sub-questions and have some more interactive dialogue and talk about how we can organize that and present that in future sessions. And then we'll wrap it up and talk about action items next. So Kate, if you want to go ahead and we'll go ahead and go through the slides that we already have up on the policy advisory committee.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Forrest, we're ready for the next slide. So just very briefly, and hopefully you all did get to look at the pre-read materials that we sent to you, but just to put the work that you're going to be doing into the larger context, we wanted to explain a little bit about what this Energy and Climate Policy Advisory Committee is all about. We finally call it ECPAC. And so this ECPAC committee was created in the CETA law, which was passed in 2019. And you can see here what the kind of directive from the legislature was with regard to this group. due to the limited time available, we've crafted the work of this ECPAC committee to focus on the Clean Energy Fund programs. And so that is what the outcome of this group process is going to be, is recommendations for how the Clean Energy Fund programs can be better allocated. Forrest, next slide, please. So the charge of this committee is, you can see here, the proviso that sets up this committee directs us to submit the ECPAC recommendations at the end of this year. And then promptly on January 1st, the statutory language has the committee expire, as well as the budget proviso that created the committee. So this work is going to be finite, and but at the same time, it's going to help to inform the legislative session that's coming up this next year. So we have tight time frame, but important work, particularly in the context that we're seeing in terms of the economic recovery situation that we hope we're in at that point. And then just in terms of the ambitious climate goals that we're working towards as a state. So the timing of this, we feel like, is really good to set the Clean Energy Fund programs up for success. At the same time as we're doing this Clean Energy Fund work, we're also, with you all and with the ECPAC committee, we're also leading the effort to develop the 2021 state energy strategy. And so we're taking very definitive steps to make sure that the work that you're doing will align with the state energy strategy and be used as part of that process as well. So good timing again. Next slide, Forrest. So this just lists the members of the advisory committee. A couple are on this call today. The proviso itself set out what organizations needed to be represented on the committee, and you see those reflected there. The committee as a whole will meet about 3 times between June and September-ish. It could end up being 4 times. And I just want to make sure that you know that if you want to listen in on those advisory committee meetings, you certainly can, and just let Bob know, and we'll make sure you're hooked into that process. Next slide, please. So this is the kind of general schedule that we're operating under. Again, it's very ambitious. We got a lot of work ahead of us, but we had an advisory committee kickoff meeting a couple weeks ago, and now we're kind of in the stakeholder session process. So as you may know, there's 3 general program areas that the Clean Energy Fund programs have been focused on. And so these stakeholder sessions are addressing those in parallel process between June and July, are addressing the 3 program areas. So we have 3 parallel groups going on, just like this one. And then we'll bring the outcome of this process back to the advisory committee, who will then finalize some recommendations, and we'll package it up and submit it to the legislature by the end of the year. Next slide, please. So these are the 3 CEF kind of general program areas. You might notice that we've labeled them. For example, this program area that you're focusing on has historically been called grid modernization. We are deliberately relabeling them kind of to allow for out-of-the-box thinking, because we want to consider the possibilities, I guess, with what Clean Energy Fund grant money could be spent on, or how we could structure these programs. So that in inviting stakeholders to the table in all three of these areas, including the list of stakeholders that we have represented on the call today, we're really making an effort to have a broad brush with the participants. And so it includes people who have benefited from Clean Energy Fund programs in the past, but it also includes folks who may benefit in the future, or may have ideas about how we can adjust or expand or narrow even these programs. Okay, that's it. Next one, Forrest. So lastly, just wanted to mention that that equity and environmental justice and thinking about vulnerable populations and low-income issues is going to be a part of this work. This is the language from the last budget proviso that we had for the Clean Energy Fund. The legislature itself kind of invested this commitment to these values into the work that we do with the Clean Energy Funds. And we're asking you as a group to help us think about how we can better incorporate equity and environmental justice into our grant programs that distribute these funds. And you'll hear later on in a little bit about one way we've attempted to do that in terms of the transportation grant program that we've just recently launched. But we're looking for other ideas definitely to take these issues into account as we craft these programs, and particularly make recommendations to the legislature. We have a lot of opportunity with the Clean Energy Fund, both in terms of economically trying to help vulnerable communities, but also making sure benefits and burdens are spread out proportionately. So that's what I've... Okay, go ahead.
It's a question from Lisa Rennie from Potomac Power, and the question is, how or when will ECPAC's recommendations align with the state energy advisory process? Which is a good question. Lisa, if you want to unmute and expand on that question, please.
Well, good morning. I'm Lisa Rennie with Potomac Power. And first I wanted to say thank you to Department of Commerce staff. That all the materials you sent out were really great. So I'm looking forward to using them to kind of talk with other staff and colleagues within Potomac Power to bring their expertise into this process. So thank you. My my boss is on the State Energy Plan Advisory Committee, and so heard you mention that. I think there is mentioned kind of appropriately a connection between these recommendations in terms of what the energy strategy may come up with, and what CPAC. What are we?
ECPAC. Yeah.
Sorry, not CPAC. That's for, you know.
Oh, we have an acronym for everything. Yes.
Yeah. So I was just curious, and maybe we just think about that going forward. You know, it seems to be there.
So Lisa, yeah, I'm leading the process for the policy at Commerce for policy on the energy strategy, and so we're very much making the connection.
Right through lunch. If you ever make yourself a
somebody needs to mute.
Drink, I wouldn't mind having some.
Anyway, we are definitely making that connection. The consultants who are working on the energy strategy are very anxious to see the outcome of this process here, and we will make sure it gets folded in. And yes, I'm working closely with your boss and others on that advisory committee. So that will happen, but thank you for that. Is there any other questions?
I just add to Kate's response that it would have been great if we had the luxury of time to go through, the state energy advisory process in more of a sequence and sequence it with this process. But with all the different things that have to happen this year, they overlap significantly. Okay, well, if there isn't anything further, I think we can go ahead and go to the next part on the agenda, which is to go through some of the background material. So Forrest, could you go ahead and open the background slide deck? Okay, thank you. So like I mentioned earlier, this background it's mostly going to go over what's going on with the grid mod program over the last several years, which has been around since the beginning. And then we'll talk a little bit about electrification of transportation. Michael Barish is going to walk us through that. And Forrest is also going to talk a little bit about the grant management program, management of that program, and the CEF solar program. So next slide. So that's our typical slide about all the different things Commerce does. Many of you have seen this before, or if you've seen the other presentations on overview I've done. And I think most of you are aware that it's a very diverse organization. Next slide. Okay, so the Clean Energy Fund programs has multiple facets to it. Kate talked about that earlier, and how the three main programs, which was the grid modernization, the research and development, and demonstration, and the grants to nonprofit lenders. So that's the three stakeholder groups we have. And then, like I mentioned, the more recent solar deployment and ETS has been combined with this group for the purposes of this discussion. So this particular group is the largest of the three, and it's very diverse, and there should be some interesting dialogue as we move forward with some of the key questions about how these things should work together in the future, moving us towards the current set of goals. Underlying all that, though, is transforming and modernizing the energy sector, and opening markets and addressing opportunities for clean energy and low carbon technology. Next slide. So CEF1, which started in 2013, was originally one of the proviso items, and what I've listed there is that it was specifically targeted to utilities in Washington State that had provided retail service to customers. They were, requested to form partnerships with vendors and other research institutions. We initially had $15 million in that work with, and was very specific that the projects had to comply with those 4 sub-bullets I list there about integrating intermittent renewables through energy storage and other information technology, being able to dispatch those assets from the central utility control room, and it did allow use of thermal properties of buildings in our district energy systems. Just a little comment on that. Later on, we were able to start seeing some of those kind of projects with those features, but initially the first round of projects, and actually the second round of projects, mostly focused on using electrochemical energy storage combined with other forms of distributed generation, primarily solar. And then the other bullet there was to improve reliability and reduce the cost of intermittent or distributed energy. We formed an advisory panel. It was a fairly diverse group of industry, many of which were from out of state, but involved in similar type programs in other states. And then there was also some in-state representation. We've actually used essentially the same makeup for that advisory panel for CEF 1, 2, and 3. There a few minor substitutions due to some retirements. But essentially it's been the same group of people, which has been, in one way, beneficial because they were familiar with the programs, but in another way, it was also somewhat narrow, and it somewhat matched with the narrow criteria and qualifying organizations. Next slide. So as a result of that solicitation process, we kicked off in 2013. And in 2014, we announced the awards of 4 projects with 3 utilities that combined 7 megawatts and 15 megawatt hours of battery energy storage. I'm not going to go through in detail all those projects. Many of you are familiar with them. Many of you that are on this WebEx participated in those in some way. One thing I would add is that when we first started this, there was a lot of concern about how we were going to do the analysis or valuation of these. So we used some of the funds in the RD&D program and combined some resources with US DOE to do the use case analysis, and that was provided by Pacific Northwest National Lab. All those projects have been installed, the data's been collected, the analysis has been done, and we've been compiling the summary of that into some reports, some of which we have, some of which are still being wrapped up. I'm not going to go into the details of all that, but that was a significant body of work. And one thing I'd add is that it was kind of challenging at that point to get interest from the utilities. During that time, I contacted a lot of the utilities where I knew various people in management and engineering, and didn't get a whole lot of engagement. But as we move forward, we did start seeing more interest from some of the other utilities in this subsequent program. Let's go to the next slide. This just is a few pictures of those installations with an overview showing the locations of where those were installed, different parts of the state, both urban and rural locations. Some of those are still in service and operational, and some of those have since been taken out of service because there were some problems with reliability of the system or some other environmental concerns. Next slide. So while we were in the middle of installing the CEF1 projects, we got an additional $13 million in the next legislative session. And we kicked off another round of proposals and review and awards. And that resulted in 5 projects being awarded. All of them had some aspect of combining electrochemical energy storage with solar, and some of those were the solar component was a community solar build out. Some of it was just a utility or private partnership with the utility build out. Those are all currently in various phases of construction. All of them except the one with Energy Northwest also feature a microgrid for resiliency and various other use cases similar to the use cases that were analyzed in CEF1. As we go through the remainder of the summer and into the fall, we'll be having additional press releases and announcements about those projects coming online, and various dedications as is possible under the current circumstances. At this point right now, I would say all of them except for the Seattle City Light one are very active in construction right now. And later on in this, there may be opportunity for some of the participants here that represent those projects to talk a little bit more about it. The only one that's a bit on a pause right now is the Seattle City Light one at Miller Community Center on Capitol Hill. and that's because the site has had some delays due to the site being repurposed under the current situation in Seattle. Next slide. So this here slide also is just a little bit more detail on what each of those projects involves. We'll be making these slides available to everybody. So, and that information is on our website, also on the grid mod page, if anybody wants to know more about a particular project. Okay, and then again, a couple years later, another legislative session, they reappropriated, or they reappropriated funds from those projects that were already underway and provided another $11 million, 10.5 million of which was targeted for actual grants. All the criteria for both CEF 2 and 3 was very similar to the original criteria established for CEF 1, grid modernization. We kicked off that solicitation process in July 2018. Again, it had a similar process of a two-phase process as we used for CEF 2, where we asked for concepts, we provided feedback, and then anybody who engaged in that was allowed to go to phase 2. We received 5 final submittals in late 2018. We went through those and did some selection and negotiations. Thus far, 2 of those projects have gone into contract. One of them dropped out. Another one did not meet threshold criteria. And one of them is still in negotiation. And I expect we'll be doing a joint press release on the 2 projects that have recently gone into contract. We'll be sending that joint press release out now, probably in early July. And then some activities have already kicked off on those 2 newest projects to develop the teams and design criteria. We anticipate those will go into various phases of design and build out over the next few years, with them coming online in around 2022 into 2023. So one thing I want to point out is these projects, the ones that have been developed thus far, they all typically take at least 2.5, more like 3 years to fully go through the various phases of design and procurement and installation and collecting data. So, you know, these are not projects that are by any means off the shelf, and they overlap quite a bit with the timing of when funding is being reviewed and allocated. So we typically have to reappropriate funds for these at least once, sometimes twice, because of the timing of the budget cycle. Next slide. So some observations on the CEF3 grid modernization is we've started to see a more diverse range of energy storage technologies. I mentioned that earlier. Being combined with distributed generation, we've seen more interest indicated in the applications due to customer interest in deploying distributed energy resources. Again, there's quite a bit of interest in microgrids for resilience and transactive energy type themes. We're seeing the use cases narrow down more from what it originally started with. And we're seeing that a lot of the projects focus more on longer duration type energy storage, matching with those types of use cases. I mentioned earlier about the 4 submittals we're evaluating which one went into contract. The next slide. So if Forrest, why don't you go ahead and talk about the ETS CEF3 program a bit?
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Forrest Watkins. I'm grants program manager covering the electrification of transportation systems, or ETS program, as well as the solar deployment program. And I work with Bob on grid modernization as well. So let's talk through the electrification of transportation systems program here, and then go into solar deployment a little bit too. For the ETS program, there were about approximately 10.67 allocated under Clean Energy Fund 3 to support the beneficial transformation of electric transportation markets through the deployment of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And the grants are for retail electric utilities, federally recognized travel governments, and local governments. And through the program development process, priority the projects that assist in local and tribal government fleet electrification, that serve multiple end uses, and that deliver benefits to highly impacted and vulnerable communities. And Michael Breach, who's on the line as well, and led the program development, will be talking a bit more about the features of the program that prioritize an equitable distribution of projects. The timeline is up on the slide there, but the solicitation opened earlier this year in February. We've seen a high degree of interest in the program, with over 200 questions submitted during the Q&A process. And then going forward, we will, all applications will have been submitted by July 30th. We'll go through review and selection, and expecting to complete that by December, and then getting projects under contract and working in spring 2020, and likely the projects extending through 2024. For the solar deployment program here, under that program, $4 million in state and federal funds were allocated under the Clean Energy Fund 3 for the deployment of solar projects in Washington. A little more than 1.5 million were awarded to 3 projects in the spring of last year. And then reappropriation of the remaining funds based on stakeholder input to lower the minimum project size to 100 kilowatts and to clarify low-income benefits. And we're currently active in program development for a solicitation for the remaining funds, which is currently around 2.3 million. And we're expecting to hold a short public input period in July, and then the solicitation should run through the fall of this year, with anticipated awards and negotiations in early 2021. I'll pass it back to you, Bob.
Thank you. One other thing that I just want to clarify is that the CEF grid modernization programs have not allowed the cost of building out the solar to be an eligible asset for match. And that was an issue that actually came up in CEF2. And the primary reason for that is because in many cases, the utilities that were making those applications were trying to use build out of solar assets that were funded through other state programs in various forms, and including like this newer program that Forrest talked about, but even some previous programs. And so to avoid a conflict there, because the match criteria does not allow you to use one form of state funds to match with another form of state funds, we had to exclude that. Just to add a little bit on CEF4 grid modernization, in last legislative session, they did allocate some funds for grid modernization, but a pretty good sized chunk of it was carved out for what is actually a transportation related marine terminal electrification. And so the funding available in the 2020 budget is only 1.5 million. But there are also about $3 million of uncommitted funds that remain in the CEF3 grid modernization. Again, it had very similar project and applicant criteria to the previous CEF 1, 2, and 3 grid programs. But it also, the CEF 4 had the additional requirement for incorporating low, moderate income and equity concerns that Kate talked about earlier. The program development for that is pending the outcome of some of these developments with ECPAC and potential realignment of CEF with CETA legislation goals. Next slide. So Michael's going to go ahead and talk about some of the specifics of the ETS program. Michael?
Can everyone hear me? Or Bob, can you confirm?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. As folks mentioned earlier, my name is Michael Breach. I'm a senior energy policy specialist in the State Energy Office Group in the Energy Division, and was the main architect of ETS. It was one of my first projects when I started. And Forrest graciously and was a huge help getting it across the finish line. And as Kate mentioned earlier, CEF4 requires an equitable distribution of benefits, or a high prioritization of vulnerable communities. And through ETS, we actually pivoted to supporting highly impacted communities and vulnerable populations even before that language was inserted into CEF4. But it was born out of an opportunity to really deliver these benefits from electrified transportation to communities that would disproportionately benefit from them because of their disproportionate impacts from air pollution and climate change. So I'm just going to walk through very quickly some of the structural elements that we incorporated to accomplish that. Next slide, please. So there are really three things that we did. Main areas. The first one, which is not actually discussed in this slide deck, is the extensive outreach we did early on to environmental justice groups, community-based organizations to co-create this program. And one of the reasons there was a pretty significant delay in getting this rolled out is that when we got feedback, we got, I think it was almost 100 pages of comments. We had, I think, over 40 individual commenters. And we basically had to rebuild the program from scratch, which was, we're glad we did. And I think our results show that we really listened to our community members and delivered a program that meets their needs. But it required a kind of scrap and restart. So the second area we did in terms of serving communities is we addressed the funding requirements. So for most grants, not just CEF, there's usually a one-to-one match. And based on the relationships we have with communities and organizations that are interested in these grants, a one-to-one match, especially for technology that can be quite expensive, is a significant barrier. And so what we did is we reduced that match into two tiers. And as you can see here, we created two options, and I'll get to those in a moment. If you met one of the options, you had a 1 to 5 reduced match. So for every $1 you spent, you'd get $5. And if you met both options, you'd have a 1 to 10 match. And so can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So the first option was that all sites, so all proposed charging sites of a project had to be below the state's area median income, which, as you can see here, we determined using the American Community Survey, part of the U.S. Census Bureau, and we did it was a 5-year rolling average, and we used the 2018 data. And so you can see there we highlighted this, the median income. And the reason we pursued this option was recognizing that for a lot of communities that would, highly impacted communities and vulnerable populations, there is economic barriers to having the financial resources to deploy these technologies. And we wanted to capture those communities who are experiencing acute economic disadvantages. And we had debated using poverty data. There was one other metric that is escaping me right now. Unfortunately, I don't have my notes because my computer's being a little funky right now. And we went with area median income in part because that aligns with what our weatherization and HIP programs do as well. And every site proposed had to be below this threshold. Next slide, please. So option 2, which will lead into a much bigger discussion about the criteria. We incorporated the Washington Tracking Network, which is an environmental health disparities tool. And for those who are unfamiliar, that type of tool is a cumulative impacts analysis that uses geospatial data to determine key indicators in communities in order to make informed policy decisions. So the indicators that are used in the Washington Tracking Network tool, and the big one that many folks are probably familiar with is CalViralScreen, are environmental and health indicators. And so for and environmental can include like ozone, particulate 2.5, soil pollution, and then socioeconomic can be the average mortality rate, or the newborn birth weights, these individual indicators that can reveal the unique lived experiences of these communities. And so one metric that the Washington Tracking Network has, it's called the environmental health disparities rank or value, and that is a combination of a number of individual indicators rolled up into an average score, so both environmental and health scores. And so we said, if you want, for option 2, if every site is at an 8 or above, and the way that the WTN rolls into these, creates these ranks, it's from 1 to 10. If you're an 8 or above for every site, you will qualify for option 2. And then if you meet both and this captures the environmental burdens that communities face. So if your sites, your proposed charging sites capture both the economic forces that communities are facing plus the environmental and health forces, you get both options, which is a 1 to 10 match. And we designed that in order to reduce the barriers that many projects that would provide these benefits face within their communities, and try to signal, not only to reduce those barriers, but to signal to applicants that if you deliver, regardless of your wherewithal, if you deliver these projects in these sites, you will have a reduced financial barrier. So we're not mandating it, but we're strongly signaling that there's advantages into pursuing these projects. But primarily we were doing it so that we could eliminate one of the key barriers into getting projects off the ground for a number of organizations and communities. Next slide.
Michael,
Yeah.
Just real quick, there is a question about the tracking network, and folks were wanting access to it, and it looks like that has been posted in the chat, the link to it. So
yes, thank you for
and yeah, so it is publicly accessible.
Yes.
Michael, this is Lisa Rennie at Tacoma Power. Hi.
Hey, Lisa.
I hope you're doing well. Quick question on the because CETA, has the Department of Health, University of Washington Climate Advisory Group task of creating, I think, a more for cumulative impacts analysis and a mapping tool. And I think this is if I'm right, Washington Tracking Network is kind of the underlying base, maybe, that they're building off of. Will that be brought into when I guess my question is, when that work is done, the cumulative impact analysis, will that be incorporated into future grants of this nature, or this kind of two-tiered system?
That's a really good question. I'm going to address the first part really quickly. I am beyond ECPAC, and then the what are they called? They're essentially they're not offsets, but the ETPs, energy transformation projects. I'm fully uninvolved with CETA, but I do work closely with Sarah, who's leading the low income. And I think the desire is that for Washington's environmental health disparities tool will be the WTN, and so it's adding additional data, it's adding additional analytical tools within that map in order to have it be a centralized resource for private and public sector. And I don't think I could be wrong, and so don't quote me on this, but I think the process is just to identify what is that environmental health disparities analysis, and like you said, it's going to be built into WTN. To the question, the goal is to use the lessons learned from ETS into future CEF grants. Certainly, if ETS is funded in the future under some other sort of transportation charging infrastructure, we would want to use this experience and build on it and certainly expand it. We didn't do everything right here, far from it, but it was a really instructive learning process. So the goal is, yeah, to incorporate this tool where appropriate and possible. And it's missing data that would compared to say the Cal and Virus screen, but I think there is an effort by Department of Health, who owns the tool, to start folding in more data to make it a more dynamic and accessible tool.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Yeah, I think that would be great, particularly from the utility perspective, because the cumulative impact analysis tool we'll have to use that in our integrated resource planning. So it sounds good if we're all working from the same data. Thank you.
We definitely should be. I think it would be a huge problem if we started splitting off. And yeah, so there is an effort to, and we really appreciate all the work that DOH and their partners have done in getting this tool up and going. But yeah, there's definitely more work. And I think someone said a question about like downloading the data or import. And something that, for example, that I want to do in the long run with this tool is to fold in the locations of charging sites. And so we can do a gap analysis within the WTN to say, okay, where are we missing chargers for whatever end uses we might need, plus overlay that with key air quality information, plus other health or like economic indicators. Boom, these 10 spots would benefit from infrastructure installation to accomplish that. And so that's one example of we need to roll in data. I think DOH is very interested in this. I know there's a process to start folding in data. It's definitely not as easy as it sounds, but for folks who think there's an opportunity to add more data to this tool, I would encourage you to reach out to DOH to have that conversation. So just to get through this presentation, because we have a lot of material to cover, the last part, how we designed ETS to serve highly impacted and vulnerable populations. So we had the outreach, we had the match requirement, and then we have the scoring criteria. So of all the categories of points that applicants can earn, the largest source of points was from the equity category, or highly impacted and vulnerable communities, as you can see on the slide. So we use the WTN to generate for a number of criteria. And so we included the environmental health disparities again, because as you, just so you recall, for the match the reduced match, you had to score an 8 or above. But when scoring these projects, we wanted to make sure that we captured any project that was 8 or below. And so we scaled points based on from the 0 to 10, or 1 to 10, as you can see on the right. There's also environmental exposures, which is one of the feeds into environmental health disparities, but we wanted to specifically capture that value because your EHD might be lower due to other indicators that feed into it, but your environmental exposures might be higher. And that's primarily NOx emissions. I think there might be one more pollution metric that goes into there, but I know it's mostly informed by NOx. And then WTN also has transportation costs, which we wanted to capture as well. Next slide. We also incorporated data that's not currently within the WTN. So one is rural status, which is something that our weatherization and HIP program uses based on, oh my God, a federal agency, and I'm totally blanking out right now. It's the the housing agency, the federal housing, and I'm sorry that I'm forgetting its name, but they have essentially HUD. Thank you guys.
Yeah.
It's Friday and my brain is half here. So you can see that that's the map that our weatherization and HIP units use for if you're entitled or not. So you would determine if your sites were in one of those counties, and then there's a specific category for certain cities. We also used EPA NADA, which is the National Air Toxics, I think it's assessment. I actually borrowed that from Ecology, who used that in their VW settlement, but it's an inventory of over, I think, 400 known air pollutants, and their EPA maintains a website of counties that have those, and so we wanted to ensure that we are capturing. And many of those air pollutants are generated from combustion of fossil fuels for transportation, so we wanted to capture that. And then finally, again, we brought in area median income because we scaled it based on quartile. So not just, we wanted to capture applicants who might be above the state area median income and award them points on a scale. Next slide. And so finally, really quickly, we recognize in working with our community partners and doing literature review and looking at other projects that have attempted to deliver benefits to communities for electrification projects, it's just not quantitative data. There is a lived experience for communities that can't be captured through measurement, and it's building relationships, it's meeting need. And so we recognize that we needed to have another element of the application that would show how an applicant is meeting communities where they're at and having meaningful engagement, determining if an electrification project would actually benefit the community, would serve their interests, how could it do so, rather than simply just, pour washing for and dropping some charging infrastructure there and saying that they did a good job. And so we put this in here to capture direct benefits to highly impacted communities and also indirect benefits, recognizing that for a lot of communities, technology is out of reach due to cost, technical barriers, but the air quality benefits, the lower cost of operations can flow to communities in other ways, and to be cognizant of that and try to capture that in a qualitative response. And then finally, as many of us are learning and know, is that we need to co-create. And so that starts with sitting down at the table with community members from the very beginning and showing meaningful engagement. And then ultimately having your proposal reflect what dialogue with community revealed, how does your project actually meet these needs? And so that is a key part of our scoring criteria. I think next slide is the last slide. Yes, so I just wanted to run through this was our first attempt. I can't speak to in detail about the specific impacts of these programmatic designs, but I can say overall that we've seen some really exciting and impressive work from applicants that really pivoted projects to serve communities as a result of our design, and we have a lot of work to do to refine it. And we're going to be doing some research over the summer to show exactly what type of shifting happened as a result. But we're excited to see how this can be improved, and as Lisa asked, how we can integrate this into other grants at Commerce. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was very informative on how that fairly new program featured the criteria and how it was involved with developing data, and we're still processing it, so it'll be interesting to see how that what the results are. The next thing we had on the agenda was to move into some discussion topics, particularly around how some of these programs have been done in the past and how some of the more recent ones have evolved, and how that can be reflected in some recommendations for program improvement in the future. So will we go ahead and open the discussion?
So Bob, this is Kate. You just might want to, maybe we just want to make sure that there's no more questions for Michael or for you about the content that people already heard. Make sure that we've addressed any questions, and it maybe we have.
I'm not seeing
Okay.
additional questions in the chat box, but if somebody does have a question about some of the material we just presented on background or current programs, this would be a good time to unmute yourself and bring that up or put it in the chat box.
Hey, this is Tanya Barum.
Hi, Tanya.
Hi, Bob. Michael, I just wanted to say thank you for that presentation. That was really, really interesting and thoughtful. Love the tool. Thank you all for sending the link. And would just love to see if there's sort of a programmatic, what the programmatic envelope is for that. Just some questions about that tool. Are you also looking at sort of, it'd be interesting to see where the weighting occurs for some of the scoring. I know there are some issues around workforce development, jobs, racial equity. It's really hard to sort of balance all of those considerations and the weighting of the model. So would just love if you have any technical documents for the tool that we could review. That would be great. Don't want to drag too many of those points out and take up too much of the meeting, but definitely interested and really excited about this.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I will share a link in the chat box. And thank you for the kind words. And definitely credit is owed to all the folks who, like I mentioned, DOH, they did a collaborative effort with Front and Centered and some other communities to build it. So they've done a lot of the hard work, and we are, we just have this opportunity to use the fruit of their labor to start delivering benefits to communities. They have a report that explains each metric and the methodology behind it. The website's a little confusing because you're actually in the tool, at least previously, you could go in and actually find the sources of data. I don't think that's in the report necessarily, but it's a little wacky in the linkage. But I will share the report, which should provide at least an initial explanation of each of the methodologies. And most of the data is just data that is already being collected. For example, all the air quality data that ecology and EPA collect, the employment and income data that the census collects and that OFM sorts. So there's from my understanding, there's very little new data that is actually created, and it's just centralized and through GIS. But the report is excellent, so I'll share that right now so folks can look further.
So there was a question in the chat box about CEF4. Generally, that plan is somewhat on hold right now due to resource availability, but we're probably going to be looking at developing the CEF4 grid program and some of these other programs later this year, and hopefully that'll incorporate some of the input we get from this process.
Hi, Bob. It's Lisa Rennie again. I had to step away for just a few minutes and take a call, but are you asking for some specific input at this point? Because something had occurred to me that I thought might be kind of helpful.
Are you talking about regarding CEF4 opportunity?
Yeah. Well, let me. What I was wondering is you went through kind of the history of particularly CEF3, and now we're coming up on CEF4, and there's a certain amount of uncommitted funds available. I was wondering if it might be helpful to get kind of a compilation of maybe the reasons some projects proposals didn't meet the criteria ultimately, or in order to be kind of a learning, if we're looking at how we might change things, just kind of what were some of the barriers to some projects moving forward, so we could think about that.
Yeah, we've already done a debrief with with your organization about that. And
no, I'm actually not speaking specifically about ours. I'm just thinking, it sounded like there have been, over the Clean Energy Fund's history, there have been projects that couldn't move forward for various reasons. I was thinking it might be, educational to understand what those various reasons are. I mean, maybe there's just like 3 categories or something for us to think about.
Yeah, there have been a few. There've been a few cases where people wanted to do a particular project, but it didn't align with the criteria, which was a relatively narrow criteria. For the size of the project was just below the minimum threshold. So all those things are things that can be revisited as we go forward. But for right now, for the way it's currently structured would be consistent with the previous criteria, and which was relatively narrow.
Okay.
And so it would be rather difficult to change that without going back and getting some clarification or redirection approved by the legislature.
Right.
So it's an awkward situation.
I understand that. I guess I was thinking more about kind of what I think is part of our mission here for this stakeholder group is to thinking forward. I'm thinking beyond CF4, right? Future.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and I think as we get into these discussion points, embedded in those discussion points are subtopics that essentially I think line up with what your area of questioning is. So Forrest, can you go ahead and bring up that next slide? So we have about 40 minutes or so left to talk through some of these discussion points. And if we put them into some slides here, somebody's got some background noise going there. Could everybody please go ahead and mute? Thank you. So we're gonna step through these, and this is an opportunity for people to ask additional clarification questions and provide commentary. I anticipate as we go through this, we're going to have some additional, at least one additional session, maybe to break these down into breakout groups or more focused groups. And I haven't quite decided yet what tools we're going to use on that. We may use some sort of survey to find out, get some feedback and find out what people's highest degree of interest is. And there's a lot of material here to cover, so we're going to just generally present the questions that we have outlined thus far. And if people feel that we need to expand some of these questions or sub-questions, they can certainly send that in to me or others that have been involved here so that we can better refine this process. So let's go to the general 6 categories I have listed here. We have a slide for each one of those, and we're going to walk through those. And we have to kind of keep it moving because we don't have time on that. So let's go to the next slide. Before I jump into this one, I see there's a question from Elaine Markham. Will CEF still be held to capital investments with greater than 12-year life? As far as I know, it would be, because the CEF is ultimately funded from the capital budget, and there are requirements, various requirements in the capital budget that we have to review during the process of receiving the applications and advancing them for scoring. So I think the answer to that would be yes, based on the way it's currently funded. Now, if the funding changes, which is one of these question areas, then that might also change. So first area here, regarding there's several areas that we could consider regarding where program funds are targeted, how things are structured. And some ideas have already been presented here, but more specifically, some of the questions that are, how could we direct the funds to be more structured with the CETA and the 100% clean climate goals, and also address the economy. Another area would be, what investments could be made to leverage essentially and respond to needs created by the emissions targets and electrification targets. Major technological questions we want to answer as far as focusing on specific use cases or specific regional local concerns. I think Michael Baruch's presentation on the ETS was an example of how some of that was approached. And then how can we generally design programs and outcomes around both the policy objectives that have been established and emerging technology. So with that, I guess I want to open it up a little bit there and see if anybody has some clarification type questions about that general topic.
Hey, Bob, this is Jeremy Twitchell. I noticed that comment about the investments requiring a longer than 12-year capital life. That's really pushing it for energy storage, especially given how CEF1 unfolded. How did you navigate that initially with energy storage, that 12-year capital life requirement?
So yeah, a little bit of background on that. That was a challenge for a couple of the utilities, and so what they did is they developed their solicitation document and procurement evaluation process to factor in that there is degradation of those assets, and they built into their contracts where they would do supplementation or replacement of components at midpoints within the 12-year period, so that they could bring it back up to or close to its original nameplate. And I think there was like replacement of cells and other components at 5 years, and then again at 10 years in some of those contracts.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, this is Forrest jumping in as well. I just wanted to raise that we did for the ETS program. For that program, there was a exception granted to lower the minimum equipment life, I believe, to 5 years. I'm less familiar exactly with what the process was to determine that. I know it can be an extended process and is not something to necessarily be taken lightly, but there may be some flexibility depending on, of course, providing a strong technological justification for that and for why it is core to the needs of the program.
Similar to that, or following on to that comment, this is Tanya with Community Energy Lab. My understanding was as well, I mean, we had to, when we looked at the projects that we were working on, we did have to go deeply into every single task and see how much of it was allocated to sort of integration engineering that was required for the functioning of the asset controls and the like. But my understanding was that if you did have software development, integration engineering, or other professional services that were necessary for the proper functioning or commissioning of a capital asset with an over 12-year life, that also qualified. Correct me if I'm wrong. That's just my recollection. Of course, that designing those projects was over 1.5 years ago now, so might not be the most current recollection.
Yes, that's correct. And that's a common question that comes up during the conceptual development and review and commentary that we go through is sometimes applicants have an idea that they say fits into their modernization program, but the scope of the work specifically is almost purely software development. And with the way the criteria is written and interpreted, if it doesn't result in, you know, whatever that software work is or that integration work, it doesn't result in actual deployment of a capital asset, then it's not consistent with the intended use of the funds. So that has been a challenge for several ideas. And perhaps that's something we can drill into further and address in more detail. But we have gone back to our OFM or financial office and had to address that issue a few times.
Hi, Bob. This is Dave. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry, this is David from Seattle City Light. And that last point you made was exactly some feedback I got from my team around the first question here, which would be wanting to look at allowing for software solutions to be part of grant funding. And that's tied to what I think you were just bringing up of, you know, software solutions and platforms are such a key part of enabling grid modernization that was something we wanted to look at and talk about a little more. Some other kind of first response items in looking at this page, I think on the third question down, major technological questions, I don't think this is necessarily the biggest one, but we've been thinking about maintaining grid reliability as DER adoption increases, and what are the technological solutions for that? You know, should we be requiring new smart inverters for operational flexibility? And another quick point on the last question, you know, I think this is really important thinking about policy objective changes around emerging tech and the situation we're in right now. I think with COVID, I think there's been a big awareness of just how important grid reliability is for essential services. I think that really tees up a need to focus on, you know, some of the things we've been talking about, but job creation, equity, resiliency. I think these are all big policy objectives that we can think about factoring into our grid modernization initiatives going forward.
Yeah, those are good comments. I would say, you know, most recently, I was on a Grid Forward town hall yesterday where AMECA presented the portfolio of different programs that Seattle's in the process of developing. I was pretty impressed with that. It's a broad range, and they're you know, these programs, the state CDF program, whatever it becomes, you know, we need to take a look at how that program or the various categories within it line up with these more developed modernization programs that the utilities are working on now. And, you know, I'm just kind of reflecting back 7 or 8 years ago, you know, when I inquired with a lot of the utilities about what they had in mind, they really didn't even have much on their radar screen at that point. And it has moved forward significantly with a lot of the utilities. And there are some of the utilities that need to put a major effort into developing their own planning process for compliance. And so, you know, my own opinion on this is the Clean Energy Infrastructure Program, or however it's structured going forward, needs to be modernized in itself and to match up with those efforts that the utilities are planning on moving forward with.
Yeah, well, and those two things go hand in hand. That portfolio you're mentioning that AMECA presented is something I've been working deeply on over the past 2 months or so. And we put a portfolio together with some major transformative initiatives that in a lot of cases we probably won't be able to execute without additional stimulus funds. So this is kind of something we've developed to line up with future available stimulus funds and at the state and hopefully federal levels also. So I think that's very much something we want to do is keep the dialogue going on what we have in that portfolio, how we could match up with future funding, and how we could enable that or modify the portfolio as needed to match.
Yeah, well, anything else?
I don't know if someone else is trying to speak. This is Lisa with Tacoma Power. I think, you know, from the policy aligning the CEF with pretty sweeping policy changes that CETA is bringing forward, I think my first concern is that some of the things like the grid modernization program may be too narrowly or tightly constructed right now. And, you know, we do have kind of a lag period with CETA before the energy transformation projects would basically, a utility would be able to use those as alternative compliance until 2030. And, you know, that's under rulemaking by ecology right now. But so I think there's an opportunity to really kind of get into if CEF could further support emission reductions. There are other new technologies. It's not going to be a surprise how interested Tacoma Power is in specifically new technologies to create green fuels or electrofuels. And there's a number of different, we're getting that these technologies are coming primarily from Europe. And having the seed money to help support demonstration that this might be producing green fuels might be perfect for Washington State because of our abundance of clean energy and fairly low cost energy and our proximity to transportation, major transportation hubs. I think that might be somewhere, I think, where the Clean Energy Fund could really kind of step into a space that isn't going to be getting funding or have thus far, at least without a carbon pricing structure. There's really not a way to kind of leverage your investments or get a return on them from the utility perspective. So I wanted to mention that in particular. And then, you know, one of the things with grid modernization too, I think there is a lot of, and one other thing on that, I think these new kind of green fuel technologies, because they have multiple end uses, it's going to be, which is great, right? I mean, they could be creating demand response. They could be a storage asset. They could actually be providing direct, you know, electricity generation. So while it does complicate things, but I think it's really something we have to think about how our technology generates in the future.
Yeah, just a little bit of response to those comments, Lisa. The way the grid modernization program was structured in the past did not target those alternative fuel type developments. There would have been, I think, some possibility for that development to apply to the RD&D program, which was more for early stage development or demonstration, and more broadly defined. And I think, you know, going forward, you know, one of the challenges we have is how
it's really hard to hear you because people have their mics on. Can some people turn their mics, mute their mics?
Thank you. So I do think that we have, one of the challenges we have with this group or the larger group is how can we craft these programs to have the flexibility or you know, and focus that matches with you know, the recently adopted goals. And this has to be much more of a longer term type program because you know, the CETA talk, you know, it points to objectives, you know, at both 10 years out and 25 years out. And right now, the current structure was, you know, a couple different silos of program that were not all quite structured or managed in the same way. So,
Yes, I agree. So we do have we have both opportunities and challenges, I think, with the emergence of new technologies. And I know even this particular technology, electric fuel production technology, we're very interested, and we're part of a large partnership, and hopefully it'll get funding from the Department of Energy. But when we were working on definitions for CETA, we just knew about straight up electrolysis. And this is something different. It uses liquid hydrogen carriers, like in this case, formic acid. So I think things are happening so quickly that flexibility is going to be important, Bob. So thank you. One other comment though, in terms of grid modernization, and I'm not sure how we can address it, but beyond the hardware and the technology and maybe it gets to software and other things, the markets, centralized and organized markets, are going to be playing a much more significant role in basically how the grid operates efficiently, and hopefully most economically. So something to think about. That's a new, it's evolving, it's getting bigger and bigger. Markets are changing.
Yeah, that's a good point about the evolution of energy markets. And like, for example, with that topic right now, the way the program is, the funding constraints and the structure of it is, if the utilities say, has a program to implement, some technology and some improvements that is, for market transformation, if most of what that is software development or modification to existing energy management systems or DERMS, whatever it is, that's probably not qualify as the requirement for capital assets. Right. And yet it's critical for the change and the evolution.
Right. So it might be a conversation we need to all, at least particularly the utilities need to have in terms of where it all comes together with energy imbalance markets and all, and one of the goals of energy markets, the integrated organized markets, is to integrate new renewables. So it's exactly one of the outcomes that this fund is supposed to accomplish. Yeah.
Right. So in the past, if someone came forward with they wanted to do some software development to aid their ability to enter the energy imbalance market, and they wanted to apply for the grid modernization program, it probably would not have qualified.
With the constraints with capital budget. I'm going to be quiet. I just want to make one other point, and that is about, I think, in the case of trying to bring and attract companies to come into our area to use our electricity and our ports and other, transportation hubs for new green fuel, non-carbon emission fuel production. Those are jobs. And I think it could, in the midterm, definitely create revenue and jobs. So.
Bob, Tanya has her hand up to say something. Tanya? Tanya, are you there?
Yes, thank you. Sorry. Okay. Multiple layers of muting were going on. I just wanted to make one, all the technical things that are being said, I completely agree with. the questions about sort of capital versus software, these are important questions, and also about deployment of technology. So since I think we've got that covered, and I agree, I know many of the people on this call, and I know that we agree about many of those things, I'd like to do a broader contextual comment about racial and socioeconomic equity as well. You know, when we focus primarily on technology-focused deployments, whether that's software, hardware, clean tech, climate tech, or any kind of tech, there's huge inequity in those fields, and I think we know this in utilities as well, in terms of racial and gender inequity, socioeconomic equity that doesn't accurately reflect the composition of our neighborhoods, communities, or our population in the United States. And that has a self-reinforcing effect when we continue to focus on, you know, the technologies. There is a lot of bringing the public along, engaging folks all along the way that's necessary. I think the way that Michael talked about it was co-creating meaningful engagement. And you see how this happens when you don't do that. I'll give just one quick example. In the CAISO identified a reliability problem in the Moore Park Goleta substation area of SCE's territory several years ago. There was a constraint there, a reliability constraint. They needed to acquire 300 megawatts of reliability locally, either non-exporting behind the meter. They wanted to, you know, potentially fire up a gas peaker. Folks were not excited about that. That was on the beach near that area of capacity shortage. So they started looking for solar and batteries that could be sited locally. They did try to engage the communities, but the utility RFP process was so short, you know, 4 or 5 months maybe, that none of the communities could really get together, figure out their zoning problems, figure out permitting and licensing problems, other land use problems that contributed to not being able to site generation. And so they met the, I think, 300 megawatt goal, but it was all through battery storage with no generation locally on site. So one thing that becomes a problem is that bringing communities along to understand why these technologies meet sort of core equity, reliability, affordability, and clean energy goals of theirs takes time, and it takes a methodological process. Many people on the call know that at PECI we spent 3 years developing a process for engaging communities, but it can take up to a year to help communities understand how their goals relate to issues around infrastructure, architecture, technology. Now, if that process can't be part of the grid modernization grant, then I believe that it would be very important for example, the research and development grant to precede that money, or even I noticed that there was a very small community climate grant to help communities do advanced energy planning as part of their general comprehensive plan. And that those communities that are given the time to sort of get up to speed on advanced community energy planning are preferenced when it comes to grid mod, so that by the time we're talking about capital funding and technologies, these communities are up to speed and ready to engage with utilities, with manufacturers, with energy technology providers in a really constructive and useful way. And I know Elaine's on the call. Elaine, I don't know if you want to speak to that at all with the meetings that we had, for example, in Tenino with Burns and McDonnell and the community. But before we had those meetings, you know, a year before that, people in the community still referred to solar as alternative energy. So, you know, that process of education and co-creating requires some pipeline steps before it. And I think it would be good for grid mod to sort of align itself as the most mature stage of funding for the technologies in a pipeline of project development that works on that sort of community outreach, community initiation of these projects, and co-creation. Gives them the appropriate time to get up to speed. That's my comment.
So just a few comments to your comments. First of all, I think Elaine has already jumped off.
But Bob, just so you know, we do have a couple other people with their hands up.
Okay. But yeah, those are good points, Tanya. We have had some discussion in the past about trying to develop more of an outreach or pipeline process to support potential applicants to be more ready or further along. And that, you know, there's challenges with that. Some of the aspects of that are embedded in some of these other questions in the next few slides. Let's go ahead and see where there's some other folks have their hand up.
Maybe Eleanor, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I am Eleanor Bastian. I had to jump over from another CEF work group, so I wasn't here for the beginning of the call, but I'm with the Washington Environmental Council. And I thought Tanya's comments just now were fascinating. I don't quite have the expertise she does, but I think they speak to a real need. And I think I'd just take it up one higher level for a second. And what I heard Bob to say a little bit is that we do now have the Clean Energy Transformation Act, and we have the requirements within that the utilities must meet, and we are hoping they will meet in the most ambitious way possible. So for me, especially when thinking about the legislature, you know, that's a big accomplishment that they had in 2019 passing that law, and that the innovation that I'm seeing here is in things like what Michael and his team did in coming up with a process that works for folks to more equitably distribute the benefits of cleaning up the grid and cleaning up our power sources. And so that, you know, more than the technology innovation we need, that I feel like it's incumbent on the utilities to do themselves now under this law. There's more shared understanding among stakeholders that we need more development in how to meet the equitable distribution of benefits. And if this fund can help utilities to realize that sooner, those are really smart investments at this point in time. And, you know, I work at a high level, and I'm also interested in learning more about the specifics here. But I think in terms of innovation, we should focus on the equitable distribution of benefits and grid modernization. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Eleanor. So I'd like to move to the next slide, because some of these next few slides touch on some of those points that were just made.
Bob, we have a couple other people who have their hands up.
Okay. Go ahead.
So Jeremy,
step up.
Jeremy. Jeremy, are you still there? All right.
Oh, sorry, I pushed the wrong button to unmute. Can you hear me now?
Okay. Yep.
Yep.
Sorry about that. I think I raised my hand again, so you can go ahead and ignore that.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is Jeremy Twitchell from PNNL. I spent some time yesterday going over the prep materials that y'all sent out, and thank you for that. That was very helpful. I have a lot of notes, a lot of thoughts. I know that we're pressed for time. A lot of people want to say stuff. Is there a mechanism for us to provide written thoughts and suggestions to the group? I don't want to tie everyone up here while I ramble.
So we haven't quite created a lot of structure on those mechanisms. I fully expect we're going to have at least one follow-up session that drills into some of these topics, and we may break it out into different groups. So I think at this point, if you could just send me an email that summarizes some of those thoughts and where you think the priority focus should be initially, so we can move forward with improving these programs and the way they're structured. That would be
okay. All right, happy to do that. I just did want to say, I guess, one top line comment. I would suggest that you start thinking about how to structure these grants and these incentives in a way that actually aligns with grid needs and contributes directly to the reduction of fossil fuel use. And I looked to how California redesigned their SGIP program a couple of years ago, where for years they had been supporting solar and storage developments, and did an analysis and found that all these developments weren't doing anything to reduce emissions. So they restructured the program, and so now a signal goes out to program participants when fossil fuel resources are coming onto the grid and says, okay, now is when your storage device should be discharging, now is when you should be releasing your stored solar power. And then the incentive is paid out based on, it's prorated based on how well the incentive is paid out based on how well my device responds to that signal. So just thinking about that kind of program design.
So Jeremy, again from
Was there anybody else that had their hand up?
Yeah, yes, Colin Young does.
Hey, I'll try to be quick here, Bob, but I just wanted to throw in, since the Clean Energy Transformation Act is going to require or going to allow the use of greenhouse gas neutrality as a way to reduce CO2 output up till 2030. I was thinking about that in terms of, well, what about electrifying vehicles, in the sense that if the utility provided some incentive, whether it be a rebate or something else, whether it be electric charging stations installed at someone's house, and then we could take the fact that an average car puts out 4.6 metric tons of CO2 a year. If that's being converted to electric, then we're really doing the same work we do as we would if we were just reducing CO2 emitting generation sources. So would the CEF program be open to some of those options that help get utilities to greenhouse gas neutrality by 2030?
That's a good question. I don't think right now the way it's written is it's structured quite that way. It's more indirect in that way.
Yeah, this is Lisa with Tacoma Power, and I'd agree that, CETA does have, I think, some challenges for direct emissions reductions. There's really, it's a clean energy standard, really. And aside from the energy transformation projects, there isn't a direct connection with reducing emissions other than through just, making sure that renewables are continually growing part of utilities portfolios. And so I think it kind of goes back to some of the things I've been talking about. And I feel like maybe technology is being seen as something that maybe is too abstract or too removed to support equity. And I think David from Seattle City Light made some good comments. I think the things that Tacoma Power is really interested in would be directly in the transportation sector. We have basically 100% clean portfolio already, but if you are producing green electrofuels that can do all kinds of things, and if it's located in a poor area or, and it is directly helping the transportation sector green up, then I think that's something we really need to support, because the transportation sector is our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. So if we can kind of help everyone. And the other point I would make, it's utilities, but the partnerships particularly are going to be more and more important, where we're pulling together expertise from multiple places and capital investment from the private sector to make these kind of projects take off. And I don't think that right now CEF is particularly friendly towards partnerships.
So Stephen has his hand up now.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
So changing direction a little here, I want to just talk about the intersection with workforce development and community engagement in our state educational programs, and just propose that an aspect of programming would be to direct funds into workforce development through our community and technology trade college network. That there is a a tendency when the economy goes into recession and people lose their jobs for people to enter into the educational sphere and go back to school. And we see enrollments rise in the community college network. Development of programs for workforce development, whether that's solar installation or grid modernization, technician, etc., would be a beneficial place to develop programs. So just wanted to contribute that.
Thank you. That's a good point.
And Scott. Scott, are you there? Scott?
Yep, can you not?
Now we can. Now we can.
Now you can hear me?
We can, yes.
You can. Okay, you had to unmute me too. So yeah, I'll start over again. So hey, good morning again. So thanks for this great conversation. It's been all really good. So I'm with Snohomish PUD, and we've received funds through Clean Energy Fund 1 and Clean Energy Fund 2, and we've learned a lot from the projects that we've done under those grants and those programs. But now our customers are starting to ask, how can we do the same thing? You know, you've put in energy storage, you're building a microgrid. Now our customers are saying they want to do the same thing. And they're coming to us and they're saying, hey, utility, how can you help fund this? How can you help us out? This stuff is still very expensive. We need a little bit of help with the economics. So I think it'd be beneficial if our customers could apply for these grants without having to go through us. I think it's still, if we want to work with one of our customers, if they want to build a microgrid, if they want to put in energy storage and apply for a Clean Energy Fund grant, they've got to go through us. We've got to be the applicant, but I think it'd be really beneficial if they could go directly to you. So is there any thoughts of moving that direction, Bob?
Well, that's actually one of the areas of discussion on some of the subsequent slides, but I would like to, if possible, just jump to the slide that talks about eligibility. I think it's the next one.
Excellent, thanks.
Yeah, so this has been a subject of much discussion in the past, and we've been constrained on having the program, at least the grid program, be very narrowly focused on utilities only, and that's caused some challenges or opportunities missed, both in the technologies allowed and who the applicants could be. I do think it was a good overview about how the ETS program has been more recently expanded. So the general question there is, should eligibility and allowable technologies, be further tailored to match up with the desired outcomes associated with CETA or other policies? And if the answer by this group is overwhelmingly yes, it should be expanded, then I think we need to probably define that a little bit more as far as what that looks like, as opposed to just wide open any kind of eligibility, and how it lines up with what we're trying to achieve for the result.
So Bob, this is Kate, and just to remind you, there's about 8 minutes left, and so it might be a good time to start talking about next steps. I want to assure everybody that we are going to capture the chat box, because there's been a lot of good thoughts going on there, and we are recording this session. I should have told you that up front, and so we'll be listening to that and trying to capture what you know, the salient thoughts that have come out here. They've all been salient, but so Bob, you might want to move into that kind of next step.
Yeah, so let me talk about that a little bit. I think, you know, it's clear to me that we have a pretty broad range of topics to discuss. We got through the first chunk of it, I'd say, but we need to have more time now that we've done the introduction of the background. We need to have more time to walk through some of these discussions and capture people's input and start to narrow it down to where are the primary feedback areas and start leading towards recommendations. So when we sent out the doodle poll, that is actually for both this first session and the second session. Second session, we were targeting July 9th. So at this point, I think we want to stick with that, and we probably want to pick up where we are or where we kind of leaving off at this point. Just to kind of lead into that, I want to take a few minutes to just walk through, you know, present the next two slides of what those topics were. We don't have time to dive into each one of them, but Forrest, if you could go ahead and toggle through. You know, the next one we had on here was on promoting jobs in the economy. We've touched on some of those topics and had some dialogue on that. Let's look at the next one. Synergies, we did touch on some of that to some extent, but we didn't really do a deep dive on it. But what that one is about is that, you know, some of these different systems and like some of the comments Lisa had or others had is that, you know, grid modernization and its relationship to, say, transportation, electrification, or you know, whether you call it alternative fuels or other solutions, they all need to have an opportunity to be evaluated and considered, especially towards how they move our state towards the overall targets. And I think this topic alone right here is probably going to need some significant unpacking and discussion about how these synergies could be potentially encouraged. Let's go ahead and look at the next one. Of course, the equity, environmental justice principles, we touched on some of that already. We had some feedback from folks. And I think I don't think there's any other slides in this package. So what I would ask people to do right now is we're going to send these slides out with the questions and the subtopic discussions. I would ask people to reflect on those and consider which of those subjects they feel they could contribute on or would like to participate in a more focused breakout group, and send that information in to us so we can identify how to match different interests up and different backgrounds so we can have some more focused breakout sessions around these topics. And that's where I think we would pick up on for our next session. And if it requires a third session, then maybe we need to do that. Comment.
Well, this is Lisa again. I think this has been a great discussion, and I really appreciate hearing other people's perspectives and experiences. And so I do have a question, Bob. Are we just focusing on the modern grid mod, or we'll be looking at some of the other CEF funds like solar? And, you know, I'm bringing that up because for years we've been trying to figure out how to deliver the benefits of solar to low income and disadvantaged communities. And, you know, we started in one place and we ended up in another. And I'm just wondering if we'll be talking. I mean, I think it might fit into some of the things that Michael, brought forward, but it's where we ended up is that the best approach we found would be to work through the actual providers of service to low income or other kind of, services that are provided and through those organizations.
So let me.
It didn't work very well. We did try to. I think we did get one small proviso change at some point a year or two ago, but
yeah. So let me just try to respond to that in the little bit of time I have left. I personally think that these programs are headed towards being merged in various ways, and also being made more flexible and aligned with what basically not just the utilities, but the utilities and their customers or society wants to prioritize, and how it aligns with these emissions targets and other goals. That's a real challenging situation, but I think it's the challenge we have in front of us. And so I do think the past structure that's been fairly narrowly defined and administered, although we've been able to successfully execute several things, it misses a lot of opportunity. And where we're at right now is this is the opportunity to better align and define what those objectives and how programs match with that.
So folks will be hearing back from us with follow-up to this, including the slides, to help you think about the questions better. And then, of course, getting more materials in advance of the July 9th meeting. I think I got that date right. And then, Bob, you would welcome any input from folks on ideas to address the questions or ideas about this process, right?
Yeah, I mean, these summary of questions and the subtopics, the way it's organized right now is a composite of some other questions or discussions we generated. I've organized these to stimulate dialogue, but maybe there's an area we haven't touched on that needs to be expanded. If someone wants to suggest that, send me an email and we'll try and incorporate that into this. But I think the next thing we need to do is take some of this feedback and try and identify smaller groups that tackle some of these different categories and provide some more specific type ideas or suggestions that we can bring forward to the larger ECPAC community.
Okay. And with one thing we're trying to mention at some of these more public meetings with our external stakeholders is just to remind you that we are under the governor's directive. We're going into a time when we're going to be on furlough occasionally. So that might limit at times your access to some of our commerce employees, including us. So Monday, for example, is a furlough day for the Department of Commerce. So we won't be working that day. But you can still send your emails and we'll read them on Tuesday.
Yeah. And some of you that have been involved with this program already know that I work only part-time on this program as it is. So it is challenging.
There you go.
Yes. Thank you. Well, with that, we're out of time or gone over. I think we'll go ahead and close things out and look forward to some additional exchange and agenda for the next session, which is currently set for July 9th. Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys.